Story 1: The House That Calls. The house on Ashwood Lane loomed over the quiet suburban street. Its gray stone exterior weathered but proud. Ivy clung to the sides like fingers desperate to hold it together. And the shutters on the windows hung crooked as though winking at the world. For decades, it had stood vacant, earning the moniker, the waiting house, among locals. People whispered tales of its history, families who disappeared. A darkness that couldn't be explained. Yet, when Mark and Susan Rutherford first laid eyes on it, they saw only potential. The move was supposed to be a fresh start. After years of renting cramped apartments, the Rutherfords finally had a place to call their own. With 2 kids, Emily, 8, and Noah, 14, they were eager to settle into a house where memories could be made. Mark, ever the pragmatist, scoffed at the warnings their real estate agent hesitated to share. Susan, a hopeless optimist, was drawn to the charm of the place, even if it felt a little cold. The day they moved in, the house seemed to welcome them with a groan. The old wooden floors creaked under their footsteps, and the air carried the faint scent of something metallic. "It's just age," Susan assured her kids, though she couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for them. It started small, as these things often do. A faint scratching sound in the walls, so soft they thought it was the wind. Emily heard it first while unpacking her toys in her new room. "Daddy, there's something in the wall," she said, her wide eyes scanning the plaster as if it might burst open at any moment. "It's probably just mice," Mark said dismissively, making a mental note to call an exterminator. But the scratching wasn't mice. It moved, traveling from one wall to the next, up through the ceiling and down again. When Susan heard it in the kitchen late one night, she paused mid-scrub, her hands trembling in the soapy water. It seemed to be coming from all around her, encircling her. "Mark," she called. But her voice was swallowed by the stillness. Then, faintly, she heard her name. "Susan." She turned sharply, water dripping from her hands. The room was empty, save for her own reflection in the kitchen window. She laughed nervously, blaming exhaustion and the stress of moving. But as she turned off the light, the reflection lingered just a moment too long, watching her leave. By the end of the first week, the house began to assert its presence more boldly. Emily woke crying, clutching her porcelain doll. "The lady said I can't play here," she whispered. "What lady?" Susan asked, her voice tight. Emily pointed toward the dark hallway. "The one who walks at night." Noah, ever the skeptic, brushed off his sister's claims as childish imagination. But one night, as he played video games in his room, he heard a soft knock on his door. "Come in," he called absent-mindedly. When no one entered, he looked up, annoyed. The hallway outside his room was empty. Yet the knock came again, this time from inside the closet. Noah threw the door open, but nothing was there. Just the faint scent of something musty and old, like a library forgotten by time. He closed the door and went back to his game. But he didn't sleep that night. The Rutherfords weren't the first to notice the strangeness. Susan's unease led her to the local library, where she scoured old newspapers and records for any mention of their home. The stories she found were chilling. In 1903, the house had been built by a wealthy merchant, Thomas Everett, as a gift for his new wife. Less than a year later, the couple vanished, leaving behind a dinner table set for 2. The property sat vacant for decades until another family moved in during the 1920s. They lasted just 6 months before disappearing as well. The cycle repeated every 20 years like clockwork. Each family vanishing without a trace. "I don't want to alarm you," the librarian said hesitantly. "But some locals believe the house chooses." Susan frowned. "Chooses?" "They say it waits. It draws people in and keeps them. No one knows why. But the house always wins." Back at the house, things escalated. The whispers became voices. Clear and unmistakable. Mark woke one night to the sound of Susan calling his name. "Mark. Come help me." He found her fast asleep in bed. Yet the voice continued, echoing from downstairs. The next day, Emily was playing in the yard when she came running inside, clutching her doll. "The boy says we can't leave," she said matter-of-factly. Mark knelt beside her, trying to mask his unease. "What boy?" Emily shrugged. "The boy in the attic." Susan's face paled. "Emily, we don't have an attic." "Yes, we do," Emily insisted. "He showed me the stairs." The family found the attic hidden behind a loose panel in the hallway. Mark, armed with a flashlight, climbed the narrow staircase, his heart pounding. The attic was filled with dusty relics, a rocking chair that creaked as though recently used, a trunk filled with old clothing, and a small wooden box. Inside the box, they found photographs of previous families who had lived in the house. Each photo was marked with a date, and all of them ended 20 years apart. The last photograph was of a family of 4, eerily similar to the Rutherfords. Susan gasped. "That's us." From that point on, the house stopped pretending to be subtle. Shadows moved freely through the halls, flickering just beyond the edge of sight. Doors slammed shut without warning. The walls seemed to breathe, their surface rippling as though something was trying to break through. One night, Susan found Emily standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, staring intently. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" Susan asked. Emily didn't answer. Instead, her reflection turned to face her mother, its eyes dark and hollow. The family decided to leave. Mark packed their belongings while Susan herded the children into the car. But the house fought back. The front door wouldn't open, no matter how hard Mark pulled. Windows shattered as though something inside was angry, its fury manifesting in physical destruction. "We have to go," Susan screamed, clutching Emily and Noah to her side. The shadows converged, swirling around Mark as he wielded a fireplace poker in a desperate attempt to protect his family. "Get out," he yelled. "Take them and go." The door suddenly burst open, as though the house had decided to let them go. Susan dragged the children outside, but Mark stayed behind, fighting the shadows. "Mark, no!" Susan cried. But the house roared, a sound that wasn't human. The last thing she saw before the door slammed shut was Mark's face, determined and unyielding. The house collapsed inward, folding into itself like a black hole. Susan and the children watched from the street, their faces wet with tears. But as dawn broke, the house stood whole again, its facade untouched, its windows gleaming with dark promise. Mark was gone. A month later, the house was listed for sale. Another family arrived, their smiles wide as they admired their new home. From the attic window, the shadows watched, waiting. Story 2: The Fugitive in the Bible School. The night was heavy with tension. The kind that settles in your chest and refuses to let go. He sat on his porch, a beer in hand, staring out into the darkness as if it held answers. The retired U.S. Marshal didn't talk much about his career. Most of his stories were locked away in the recesses of his mind. Too dark to share even with family. But every now and then, when the beer ran low, and the hour grew late, he'd open up. "It's not the shootouts that haunt you," he'd say, voice low. "It's the things you didn't do, the decisions you didn't make. The ones that stick with you. Like a shadow you can't outrun." This story was one of those shadows. The fugitive wasn't like most criminals he'd pursued. He wasn't violent, not at first. Anyway, his crime started with fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. The kind of offenses that don't make headlines. But as the months wore on, the pattern of destruction left in his wake became undeniable. This wasn't just a man on the run, it was a man who thrived on chaos. Who could bend people to his will with little more than a smile and a well-placed word. Tracking him was a nightmare. He had a knack for slipping through cracks, vanishing just when they thought they had him cornered. Then came the tip: he'd been spotted at a Bible school in rural Ohio. It seemed absurd at first. Why would a criminal hide in a religious community? But the more they looked into it, the more it made sense. The school wasn't just a place for education, it was a sanctuary. The kind of place where people believed in redemption so deeply, they'd put themselves on the line to protect one of their own. The first time they drove up to the school, it looked innocuous enough, a cluster of modest buildings surrounding a grassy courtyard. Children played in the distance. Their laughter carried on the wind. It didn't seem like the kind of place that could harbor a fugitive. But the marshal had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. The principal greeted them with a warm handshake and a welcoming smile. "We're always happy to help law enforcement," he said, his voice laced with an almost unsettling calm. The conversation was polite, surface level. The kind of exchange that left the marshal feeling like he was being led in circles. They were shown around the school, introduced to staff and students. But there was no sign of the fugitive. "It's a tight-knit community," his partner muttered as they left. "Too tight." The marshal nodded. There was something about the way the staff looked at them, something guarded. Days turned into weeks, and the visits became routine. Each time, the principal met them with the same calm demeanor, the same assurances that they were mistaken. The staff were cooperative on the surface, but subtle resistance was everywhere. Files went missing. Students claimed not to know the man they were looking for. Even the children seemed to avoid the marshals, darting out of sight whenever they approached. "They're hiding him," the marshal said one evening, staring at the map of the school he'd pinned to the wall. "But why?" his partner asked. "Why risk so much for one man?" The answer came slowly, pieced together from whispers and observations. The school wasn't just a place of learning, it was a community bound by an almost cult-like devotion to forgiveness. Their faith wasn't just a belief, it was a way of life. An unshakable conviction that no sin was beyond redemption. The tension reached its peak on a cold, gray morning. Frustrated by the lack of progress, the marshal secured a warrant to search the premises. This time, they came prepared, bringing backup in the form of uniformed officers. The moment they arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Students and staff emerged from the buildings, their faces unreadable. The air grew heavy with unspoken hostility, the kind that made the hair on the back of your neck stand on end. "They're not going to make this easy," his partner muttered. The officers fanned out, moving methodically through the buildings. The principal stood in the courtyard, his expression grim as he watched them work. Then it happened. A young man, no older than 19, stepped out of one of the buildings. His face was twisted with anger, his movements deliberate as he marched toward the marshals. "Stay where you are," the marshal called out, his hand hovering over his weapon. But the boy didn't stop. The officers shouted warnings, their voices echoing through the courtyard. Still, he kept coming, his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the marshal's partner. When he was just a few feet away, they saw it, the object clutched in his hands. It was a grenade. Time seemed to slow as the realization hit. The marshal shouted, his voice drowned out by the chaos erupting around him. Guns were drawn. Students screamed. And the boy lunged forward, wrapping his arms around the marshal's partner in a desperate embrace. No! The explosion was deafening. A violent roar that tore through the courtyard. The force of it threw the marshal backward, his vision swimming as he hit the ground. When the dust settled, the scene was one of devastation. The young man and the marshal's partner were gone, their bodies obliterated by the blast. Blood stained the grass, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and fear. For a moment, there was silence. Then the screaming began. Backup arrived within minutes, swarming the school with an intensity born of grief and rage. The students and staff were detained, their protests falling on deaf ears as the officers searched every inch of the property. But the fugitive was gone, vanished into thin air like a ghost. The investigation that followed was relentless. They turned the school inside out, looking for any clue that could lead them to their target. What they found instead were whispers of something far darker, evidence of manipulation. Of a man who had convinced an entire community to shield him at all costs. He's not just hiding, the marshal realized. He's controlling them. It took another year before they caught up with him again. This time, he was in Alaska, embedded in yet another religious school. But the experience in Ohio had changed the marshal. He was more cautious now, more calculating. When they moved in to arrest him, it was swift and precise, leaving no room for escape. In custody, the fugitive was a study in contradictions. He was calm, polite, even charming. The kind of person who could disarm you with a single glance. But beneath the surface, there was something else, something dangerous. The marshal sat across from him during the interrogation, the weight of his partner's death pressing down on him. "You're good," he said finally. "I'll give you that." The fugitive smiled, his eyes cold and calculating. "People want to believe," he replied. "All you have to do is give them a reason." Even after the fugitive was sentenced to 15 years in prison, the marshal couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. He knew the man would find a way to walk free, to start over, to manipulate and destroy again. "It's not the crime that makes him dangerous," he said years later. "It's the control. The way he can make people believe in him, even when it costs them everything. And in the quiet moments, when the weight of it all became too much, he'd think about the young man in the courtyard, the one who had given his life for a lie. Why, he'd ask himself, why would anyone do that? But the answer was always the same: some people are born with a gift. And in the wrong hands, that gift can become a weapon. Story 3: Friends Turn Killers. There are stories that gnaw at the edges of your thoughts long after you hear them. Stories that make you question the very nature of trust and the darkness people are capable of hiding behind familiar faces. This is one of those stories. Amy trusted them. They were her friends. The kind of friends who sat beside her in class, exchanged harmless banter, and shared laughter over petty teenage drama. So when Mark and Jason invited her to join them for an impromptu adventure one evening, she didn't think twice. What happened that night was beyond anything she could have imagined. It wasn't jealousy or anger that drove them, it wasn't even hatred. It was something colder, more alien. They killed her for no reason other than to satisfy their own curiosity. 2 words would later echo through the courtroom and the collective conscience of a community: morbid curiosity. But what led to such horror? Could anyone have predicted it? Could Amy? The town wasn't remarkable, just another dot on the map where the days passed slowly and the nights belonged to teenagers seeking distractions from the monotony of small-town life. Everyone knew everyone. Or at least they thought they did. Amy was the kind of girl people gravitated toward. She had an easy laugh and a kind heart. The kind of person who made others feel seen. At 18, she was filled with the optimism that comes from standing on the brink of adulthood, where the possibilities seem endless. Mark and Jason were her friends. They weren't part of the popular crowd. But they weren't outcasts either. They were somewhere in the middle. The kind of boys who blended into the background. Mark was quiet, always hanging just a step behind Jason, who had the kind of charisma that drew people in. Jason was the ringleader, the one who came up with the plans, the adventures, the late-night drives that gave their otherwise dull lives a hint of excitement. That night started like many others, with a plan. It was late when Mark and Jason found Amy at a house party. The music thumped against the walls, and the air was thick with the mingling scents of cheap beer and teenage bravado. Amy was laughing with a group of friends when Jason approached, his signature grin in place. "We're heading out to do some mudding," he said. "Wanna come?" Amy hesitated for only a moment. She liked Jason's energy. The way he could turn a mundane night into something memorable. "Sure," she said, grabbing her jacket. The 3 of them piled into Jason's truck. The cab filled with the sound of music and easy conversation. The world outside was dark, the occasional flicker of headlights the only sign of life as they left the party behind. They drove for miles, the paved roads giving way to gravel, then dirt. The truck's tires crunched against the uneven ground, and the air grew colder as they ventured deeper into the woods. Jason finally brought the truck to a stop near a particularly muddy trail. The headlights cast long, eerie shadows on the trees, and the faint sound of nocturnal animals could be heard in the distance. "Looks like a good spot," Jason said, turning off the engine. Amy stepped out, her boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She glanced around, the darkness pressing in on her. "So, what's the plan?" she asked, turning to face them. Jason leaned against the truck, his grin still in place. "Just having some fun." Mark stood a few feet away, his hands shoved into his jacket pockets. He hadn't said much during the drive, and now his silence felt heavier. Jason opened the back of the truck, rummaging for something. Amy couldn't see what he was doing, and she didn't think much of it until he turned around. The sound of the gunshot shattered the stillness of the night. For a moment, Amy didn't understand what had happened. She felt a sharp, burning pain in her back, and her legs gave out beneath her. She hit the ground, her hands clawing at the mud as she struggled to breathe. "Jason." Mark's voice was panicked, trembling. "What?" Jason replied, his tone almost casual. "You didn't think I was serious?" Amy tried to speak, to scream. But the pain was overwhelming. She could hear their voices above her, muffled and distorted, as if coming from underwater. "We can't just leave her here," Mark said, his voice rising. "We're not going to," Jason replied. "Help me dig." The two boys worked in silence, the sound of their shovels cutting through the mud punctuating the stillness. Amy lay nearby, her breaths shallow and ragged. She wasn't dead, not yet, but Jason didn't seem to care. Mark kept glancing at her, his hands shaking as he dug. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. Jason stopped, leaning on his shovel as he looked at Mark. "Why not?" he said. "Haven't you ever wondered what it's like?" Mark stared at him, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. But Jason's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Morbid curiosity," Jason said, shrugging. "That's all." After burying Amy's body, the boys climbed back into the truck, their clothes stained with blood and mud. Jason turned the music back on, humming along as if nothing had happened. They drove to an all-night diner on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over their tired faces as they slid into a booth. Jason ordered pancakes, laughing and joking with the waitress. Mark sat across from him, silent and pale. "You've got to relax," Jason said, his tone light. "We did what we had to do." Mark didn't respond. He just stared at the table, his mind replaying the events of the night over and over. After their meal, Jason insisted they return to the woods. "I just want to make sure everything's covered," he said. Mark wanted to protest, to tell him it was a bad idea. But he didn't. He followed Jason back to the grave, his stomach churning as they inspected their work. "It's fine," Jason said, finally satisfied. "No one's going to find her." But Jason was wrong. A few days later, Amy's parents reported her missing. Search parties were organized, and the woods were combed by volunteers and law enforcement. It didn't take long for someone to notice the disturbed earth, the patch of mud that didn't quite match the rest of the trail. When Amy's body was unearthed, the community was thrown into chaos. Who could have done such a thing? Why? The answers came when Jason and Mark tried to cross the Canadian border. Their nervous behavior drew the attention of customs agents, who discovered blood-stained clothing in the truck. The trial was a spectacle, drawing crowds and media attention from across the state. Jason was unrepentant, his demeanor cold and detached. When asked why he killed Amy, he repeated the words that would haunt everyone who heard them: morbid curiosity. Mark, on the other hand, broke down on the stand. He admitted to helping Jason but claimed he had been pressured, manipulated. Whether this was true or not, the jury didn't care. Both boys were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Years later, the narrator, someone who knew Amy, Jason, and Mark, reflects on the tragedy. "It's not just the act itself that haunts me," they say. "It's the betrayal. Amy trusted them. She never saw it coming." They pause, their voice heavy with emotion. "I can't help but wonder, how well do we really know the people in our lives? What kind of darkness are they hiding? And would we even recognize it if we saw it? Could you recognize the signs of someone capable of such an act?" The sun barely crested the horizon, casting a pale light over the house on Ashwood Lane. It looked as though nothing had happened. Its gray stone walls stood resolute, its ivy fingers clasping tightly. But Susan knew better. She clutched Emily and Noah as they sat in their car, staring at the house that had swallowed her husband. A police car arrived an hour later, and Susan recounted the events, though the officers exchanged skeptical glances. By the time an investigator entered the house, they found nothing amiss, no signs of a struggle, no shadows creeping through the halls. The photographs, the voices, the attic, all gone. The realtor's sign went up within a week, and by the month's end, a new family had moved in. Susan watched from a distance, the house's eerie pull evident even from across the street. She whispered a silent prayer for the family, though deep down, she doubted it would make a difference. As she drove away, Emily spoke up from the back seat, clutching her porcelain doll tightly. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The boy says we'll see Daddy again soon." Engagement prompt. What do you think happened to Mark? Was he claimed by the house forever? Or could he find a way back? Share your theories in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on this chilling tale. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wolf Tells for more spine-tingling tales every week. Remember, every house has secrets, and some are better left undiscovered.